James, slow down. Grandfather called out, watching his grandson pace back and forth across the living room floor. The young man, just 24 years old, had beads of sweat on his forehead. His breathing was shallow and his eyes darted anxiously. It was a familiar sight lately, but it pained Grandfather every time. "I can't, Grandpa," James exclaimed, running his hands through his hair. "I have this presentation tomorrow and I'm sure I'll mess it up. What if I forget my lines? What if people laugh? I just can't." "James," Grandfather interrupted softly, patting the space beside him on the sofa. "Come here, sit down. Let's talk." Reluctantly, James plopped onto the couch. He felt like a bundle of nerves ready to explode. "I hate feeling this way," he muttered. "It's like my brain won't stop torturing me." Grandfather nodded sympathetically. "I know how you feel, James. Believe it or not, I've been there too." James looked up, surprised. "You? I thought you were always calm and collected." Grandfather chuckled. "That's what everyone thinks now. But let me tell you a story. When I was about your age," Grandfather began, "I had my first job as a school teacher. It was a dream come true, but I was terrified of speaking in front of the students. My mind was constantly racing with what ifs. What if I made a mistake? What if they didn't respect me? What if I wasn't good enough?" Sounds familiar, doesn't it? James nodded slowly. "One day," Grandfather continued, "I froze in the middle of a lesson. The room was silent and I could feel every pair of eyes staring at me. My heart pounded, my hands trembled, and I couldn't speak. After class I wanted to quit. I felt like a failure." James leaned in, curious. "So, how did you fix it?" "I didn't fix it overnight," Grandfather admitted. "But I learned how to manage it step by step. And those same steps might help you too." "That day," Grandfather said, "an older teacher noticed I was struggling. He gave me my first lesson in managing anxiety, breathing. He told me, when you're anxious, your breath gets shallow and your brain panics. But if you take control of your breathing, you send a message to your brain that it's safe." James listened intently as Grandfather demonstrated. "Try this. Inhale slowly through your nose for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, and exhale through your mouth for 6 seconds. Let's do it together." James hesitated but followed his grandfather's lead. Inhale, hold, exhale. After a few rounds, he felt his shoulders relax slightly. "See?" Grandfather smiled. "It's simple but powerful. Whenever anxiety creeps in, start here." "Next," Grandfather continued, "I had to tackle my thoughts. Anxiety loves to make us think the worst will happen. I used to imagine the students laughing at me, just like you're imagining your colleagues mocking you tomorrow." James bit his lip. "But what if they do?" Grandfather shook his head. "What if they don't? Most of the things we worry about never actually happen. And even if they do, we're stronger than we think." I started writing down my anxious thoughts and then asking myself, is this really true? Or am I just assuming? 9 times out of 10, it was my fear talking, not reality. James sighed. "That makes sense. I guess I do jump to conclusions." "Exactly," Grandfather said. "And when you catch those negative thoughts, replace them with something positive. For example, instead of thinking, 'I'll mess up my presentation,' tell yourself, 'I've prepared well and I'll do my best.' Your mind believes what you tell it." "Anxiety also loves dragging us into the future," Grandfather said. "We get so caught up in what might happen that we forget about what's happening now. My teacher told me, keep your mind where your feet are. In other words, stay in the present." James frowned. "How do I do that?" "Pay attention to what's around you," Grandfather explained. "Use your senses. Right now, notice the texture of the sofa, the ticking of the clock, the warmth of the tea in your hands. When you anchor yourself to the present, anxiety has less room to grow." James nodded, trying it out. For a moment, he focused on the soft fabric of the couch and the faint aroma of his grandfather's tea. Felt grounding. "But what if it's still overwhelming?" James asked. "Then take one small action," Grandfather replied. "Anxiety thrives on inaction. When I felt stuck, I'd do one tiny thing. Write a sentence, practice one line of my lesson, or even just set up my materials for the next day. Each small step built momentum and made the big task seem less scary." James thought about his presentation. "Maybe I can practice just the introduction tonight?" "That's the spirit," Grandfather said, patting his shoulder. "Remember, action beats anxiety every time." "Finally," Grandfather said, "the most important lesson, don't be too hard on yourself. I used to beat myself up for feeling anxious, which only made it worse. But then I realized, anxiety is a part of being human. It doesn't make you weak, it makes you real." James's eyes softened. I never thought of it that way. Instead of fighting your anxiety, grandfather said, acknowledge it. Tell yourself, it's okay to feel this way. I'm doing my best. Treat yourself the way you'd treat a friend. The next day, James walked into the office with a nervous flutter in his stomach. But this time he remembered his grandfather's words. He took a deep breath, challenged his fears, and focused on the present moment. When it was his turn to present, his hands still trembled, but he spoke anyway. Sentence by sentence, his confidence grew. By the end, his colleagues clapped, and James felt a wave of relief. That evening he called his grandfather. It worked, Grandpa. I did it. I knew you would, grandfather said, his voice filled with pride. Remember, James, anxiety doesn't define you. It's just a hurdle, and every hurdle can be overcome. As James hung up, he realized something profound. Anxiety might visit again, but now he had the tools to face it and win.